All right, on to St. Peter versus St. Paul. We're in chapter 10 today, and the title of the chapter is Radicalism 2, the sequel. Oh no, money. Last week we talked about radicalism related to sexuality and relationships in the early Christian church. And I think we all found that somewhat confusing, and I'm going to promise that today will be equally confusing. So nothing new there.
Can you hear?
Yeah.
Can you hear?
Can you
Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Use your teacher voice.
That was the most annoying commercial ever.
And
What's
yet
that?
you keep
But
using it.
memorable.
But memorable. Okay, so here's my opening question. Has ever been confused about passages from the New Testament that deal with the topic of money and personal wealth? Anybody in this group?
That lady.
That lady was confused. I always found the church take on money and interpretation of scriptures in the New Testament, and there are scriptures in the Book of Mormon, and there are scriptures in our Doctrine and Covenants, all that deal with how we're supposed to manage money. And particularly in Community of Christ, we have been through lots of changes in the last 20 to 40 years with respect to how we do tithing. The early church practiced tithing 10% of the income. That was the very early church. I'm talking about the Latter-day Saint movement in the 1800s. I believe the Mormon church still practice. They have never changed. That's still 10% of the income. We, I think in the early 1900s, changed during tough financial times to 10% of our increase. And so you had to decide what was just wants and needs and what you just wanted and didn't need. And you paid, 10% of that. And there were lots of tricky questions every year. Does college education count? I'm going to go to college and I'm going to get a better job, and the church will benefit from that if I pay my 10% of my increase. But some people argued that college was not a just want and need. High school education was good enough, and we should do that. Lots of confusion for me growing up, and then that all went away, and then it became 10%, but it included all charitable offerings. So I could give my money to the ASPCA, and that counted, or I could give it to the church, or I could divide it equally between 10 different charitable organizations. And that's gone now. Now we're just kind of, I think I sort of gave up trying to understand, but I think we're just encouraging generosity, people to give to the extent that they can give, and still shoot for 10%. I mean, I think we're kind of still hung up on that 10%.
And there's no more requirement for the tithing statement. Remember that?
My mother filled out her little yellow tithing book faithfully. I don't know how many of you remember those kind of off yellow books, and she wrote down every penny that came into the household, every penny that went out of the household, and she meticulously calculated the family's increase and paid tithing on that. She was one of the most faithful people that I ever knew when it came to that. I'd get through about January, and then I'd say, oh, this is too hard. I'll just give 10% of what I make, and we'll do it at that. But anyway, so we have a lot of confusion in this faith journey, I think, about money. And I'm doing all the talking. I didn't want to do that. Anybody else feel that? Anyway, anybody else feel confused about money in the Bible?
Well, I've always been a little confused because Jesus seemed to always be talking to a lawyer and telling the lawyer, you need to give away all your wealth. So it's like, you just had, you had no chance in terms of Jesus's world. If you were rich, you're supposed to give it all away. And so then it kind of conflicts with the whole stewardship issue. And of course, America.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and that's a whole other thing that we'll talk about is, how does capitalism and our system of economics fit into that? We can bring that up today. Anybody else?
I'm happy to hear that he was only talking to lawyers.
I know. Which is always like one more thing against lawyers.
I think that's reading too literally there.
Good. Good.
All right. Well, let's talk about the early Christian church, and then we'll kind of try to bring it a little bit forward and talk about Latter-day Saintism and maybe how we think about it today. So this is a passage from Luke 4. Jesus has ascended into heaven, and now this is the early disciples, and they have experienced the day of Pentecost, I believe, by this time, and they feel empowered to go out and to begin preaching, to start sharing their ministry. And Luke says about that group, these apostles and disciples, the whole group of those who believed were of one heart and one soul, and no one claimed private ownership of any possessions, but everything they owned was held in common. And with great power, the apostles gave their testimony to the resurrection of the Lord Jesus, and great grace was upon them all, and there was not a needy person among them, for as many as owned land or houses sold them and brought the proceeds of what was sold. And they laid it at the apostles' feet, and it was distributed to each other as any had need. So this is kind of the all things common idea that it comes out of, it's associated with early Christianity, but I'm going to show to you that it actually existed before the early Christians, that other groups had practiced this way.
So according to that, they were all a bunch of hippie communists.
I prefer to call them communalists. However,
Interesting
our
thought.
author called them Catholic Marxists.
Exactly. Yeah, he did.
So were the early Christians practicing socialism? Does this annoy you? Does it challenge you? Was it right? We
impractical.
really struggled with it. What's that?
It seems impractical. You keep having to convert rich people that are going to sell all of their holdings and give it to the group. And where else are you going to get your ongoing expenses paid?
Well, one thing you'll notice also is that Paul was asked to take up a collection because the Jerusalem church needed money. I wonder if the properties they sold and put into the kitty.
Well, this was
had been
before Paul
expended,
now.
and
I
then
mean,
they needed.
that's correct. But what I read from Luke is before Paul is on the scene yet. This is.
But I'm drawing the point that
Yeah.
when you practice that for long enough, they ran out of money.
Oh, okay.
That's what I'm wondering.
Oh,
The
okay.
situation that they started all things common, ran out of money, and then Paul comes along a little later and they said, well, if you take up a collection, it'd be real nice.
Well, maybe they had. So they did run out of money. It does sound like that. Maybe they had too many poor people that were coming in comparison to the number of landowners who were donating everything that they had. That would be a tough thing to do. I wonder how many they truly got to, actually turn
Sounds like
everything over.
Isn't that what happened to Joseph Smith?
Yeah.
I mean, that to me
We'll
is
come
like
back
that
to
whole
that, yeah.
storehouse thing, and
Yeah,
people flocked to Mormonism.
Yeah.
And then once again, the rich had to give everything and they were not very happy. 'Cause there
Yeah, it's
were
a
more
system
poor
that
people.
works if all the money is available to be distributed, but if
Yeah.
only a few wealthy people participate, then you probably can burn through that really
And
quickly.
then they
Well,
get a little upset.
The poor people come in thinking, oh, free handout.
Exactly.
So,
Well, and we'll
Of
talk about
overabundance
some
of
of the statistics, the socioeconomic statistics that existed in the time of Jesus compared to those days that might explain some of that too.
Okay.
There was the fact that you might be struck dead.
Okay,
That's right,
Ananias
that's
and Sapphira. So that I was going to bring up that story. Anybody know the story of Ananias and Sapphira?
oh, yeah.
Okay, so they were the wealthy people who said that they sold everything and were giving all their money to the church, but what really happened?
They only gave part of it.
They only gave
They
part of it.
lied about it.
And what happened to them?
They died.
Well, according to the scripture, they were struck dead. And I have to take that with a grain of salt.
Ananias and Sapphira were struck down dead. So that's what happens if you try to cheat on your tithing, I guess. There is evidence that other groups around the time of Jesus practiced communalism and the use of a common purse. One of the first groups and the oldest groups, of course, was the Essenes at Qumran. And we know them because we've talked about John the Baptist before, and there's some speculation that John may have been an Essene. It was also common practice in those days for philosophers, for wise people, rabbis, and so forth, who went around teaching, and they would attract a group of disciples, and the disciples would care for the welfare of that rabbi who was spending all of their time dispensing wisdom and didn't have time to work at McDonald's or whatever. So the students took care of the teacher, and Jesus, had a similar pattern. He had disciples of people who were following him, and as we'll see, there were some of them who apparently provided for his well-being. And then there was a group of cynics. They're not cynical people. Well, they're cynical in a sense, I guess, but a cynic is a person in those days who renounces all their ties to the material world. They're trying to do away with social classes. They want to limit any association with any particular class. And some of them were wealthy and gave away their wealth. But that's what one had to do to become a follower of cynicism. They would have to sell everything and give the money. Now, the stipulation for the cynics was not that they had to give the money to the poor. They just had to give the money away. So you could give it to your neighbor, your parents, your brother, sister, whoever, regardless of what their status in the world was. So we do have these other groups that are practicing this kind of common purse approach to economics.
Paul?
Yes.
What was going?
Well, the Stoics, I think, were kind of the mind. Now, they may have well done some of the same kinds of things, and I know there's some speculation that the Stoicism impacted Jesus, and perhaps he was following some of those tenets. I think the Stoics were kind of, I don't care what the world brings to me. I'm going to look for inner peace. I'm going to look for the things that bring me joy and happiness and strength. Regardless of how bad things are in Ukraine or how bad things are with COVID or anything like that. But the Stoics, the cynics were the ones who, we're going to read the passage from the New Testament where Jesus challenges his disciples to go out. Don't take your suitcase, don't take your Honda, leave it all home, just hit the road. The cynics were the ones that, they took a bag, and that's all, whatever worldly possessions they had were in the bag. They didn't wear sandals, they went barefoot. And so that was a kind of a precursor to the monastic teachings of the Middle Ages to renounce all of these worldly things. So the cynics and the Stoics both sound a bit like Jesus, but there are also some differences that probably have kept the people who study those kinds of things from saying that he absolutely followed one or the other. Certainly he may have been influenced a little bit by them. All right, so what about early Latter-day Saint emphasis? I think Jane or somebody asked about that, on creating the church in the pattern of the New Testament. There was a movement in this country in the late 1700s and early 1800s by some churches, by some church groups, for Unitarianism or communalism. And I didn't know this until I actually kind of got researching a little bit this week. I always associated the Restoration with Latter-day Saintism. But the Restoration actually was a much wider movement, and Disciples of Christ and Shakers and Quakers and a lot of those other groups were using the term well before Joseph Smith came onto the scene. And what they were restoring was a return to primitive Christianity. They looked at the New Testament, they looked at Luke, and they said, and Acts, and they said, we like that. We want to have this all things common. We want everybody to be equal. And so a lot of those churches in that time period moved to that. And
I often will say, like, Latter-day Saints are restorationists, but not all restorationists are Latter-day Saints.
Yeah, good. I like that. Yeah, I like that. I like that.
Coming from Puritan time, I'm sure they were looking for something a little more joyful.
Could be. The earliest date that I saw, I think, was the Shakers in 1788. There may have been something that predated that, but that was the first one that I found. And so what we embraced, or what Joseph Smith embraced on behalf of the church, in 1831 was based on practices of these other groups, the Quakers and Shakers, from whence came Parley P. Pratt, the Campbellites, or the Disciples of Christ, from whence came Sidney Rigdon, and there were several others who I didn't recognize all the names, but I looked through Dick Howard's history book. By the way, question to see who knows their history. What was the P in Parley P. Pratt? What was his middle name? Nadine guessed it this morning and said it was parsley. She was wrong.
I thought he was joking with me. I didn't know he wanted a real answer.
Does anybody know what Parley P
Is it
middle
a
name
common
was?
name? Is it like Paul or is it?
It's not Paul.
Oh,
It's
okay.
yeah, it's a common name, but it's
Okay.
commonly it's a more of a surname than a given name.
Oh. Uh,
Preston.
Percival.
Percival.
Uh,
Okay, nobody
Nobody
knows.
actually knows. Yeah.
Okay, it's Parker, Parley Parker Pratt. I was gonna offer to share my granola bar with whoever won, but since we don't have a winner, I'm gonna eat it all.
It made me feel bad too, because it's my grandfather's name. so.
Yeah, I know.
I'll never forget it.
All right, so in this,
Probably will.
in Latter-day Saintism, we have the law of consecration and stewardship, again, which I think Jane was referring to. In our Doctrine and Covenants, it's 42, 8 through 10. Not sure about the Utah
think they're
Church
pretty
Doctrine and
close to
Covenants,
similar.
somewhere around in there. And this is from Dick Howard's book. What God said at that time was, if thou lovest me, thou shalt serve me and keep all my commandments. And behold, thou shalt consecrate all thy properties and that which thou hast unto me.
He liked that.
What's that?
He liked to say these and
Yeah,
thous.
he was a King James guy.
The old
Joseph
church, yeah.
was, for sure. And it will be with a covenant and a deed which cannot be broken, and they shall be laid before the bishop of the church and two of the elders, such as he shall appoint and set apart for that purpose. And it shall come to pass that the bishop of my church, after he has received the properties of the church, that it cannot be taken from the church, and he shall, sounds like a contract. I wonder if he had a lawyer write this.
There you go.
That it cannot be taken from the church, and he shall appoint every man a steward over his own property or that which he has received, inasmuch as it is sufficient for himself and his family. And the residue shall be kept to administer to him who has not, and every man may receive according as he stands in need. And the residue shall be kept in the storehouse to administer to the poor and needy, as such as shall be appointed by the elders of the church and the bishop, for the purpose of purchasing lands and building up the new Jerusalem, which is hereafter to be revealed, that my covenant may be gathered in one in the day that I shall come to my temple. And I think there's one additional statement that caught my eye in the Doctrine and Covenants. God said, and this shall be for the salvation of my people. So is this some kind of an ideal? Was God serious? We don't practice this way today, really. I mean, we help other people, but not
That
to
word
this extent.
residue was interesting, because maybe that's where our church got the word increase. You know, when we were changing things, because it started out as, I thought it started out as all income,
It did.
but then it became increase. So even in this scripture, he says the residue.
I think if I remember the story, and I'm kind of shooting from the hip here, but I think in the 1920s when we were building the auditorium and the Depression hit, and it was very obvious to the bishopric that it was going to be a struggle to pay for this huge building. That was the decision that was made for the bishopric to know what their income was going to be. And they decided at that time that people needed to fill out tithing statements and send them in. And it was, I mean, actually, it's kind of based on sound economic principles. You don't want to spend more than you have. And so if people are kind of making these pledges, or at least giving you this in their tithing statement, sort of know what your income is going to be to pay for this grand building. So I think that is sort of how that part of it evolved, anyway, from what I remember. Anyway, then there was an order of Enoch, which was also accounted for some of the basis of early church social and economic practices as the church awaited for the second coming. All right, I said I wanted to give you a few statistics about how we're distributed socioeconomically. So this was one reference that I found of how the Roman Empire looked in the first century CE, so this would be during the time of Jesus, approximately 1% of the population were the elite wealthy. Approximately 10% were well off, and then the remainder were slaves to the wealthy, soldiers in the Roman legion, and what were called the free poor, or if you were on the very bottom socioeconomic rung, they were considered to be destitute. So we have around 10 or 20% that had some means, and then we have this huge contingent of poor people, which I think is maybe why they were taking up the collection, amongst the Gentiles. Dennis, I think that may have accounted for some of that. And then if we compare that with our current situation in the United States, we have, again, about a 1% of a true upper class, 15% upper middle class, 34% lower middle class, 30% working class, and then we have working poor about 20%, which includes those who are definitely well below the poverty lines. So we have a little, the distributions are a little bit different in our day than they were in Jesus' day. All right, so what about Jesus? We said that someone was providing for some of his care, and this is from Luke chapter 8. Soon afterward, he went on through the cities and villages, proclaiming and bringing the good news of the kingdom of God. The 12 were with him, as well as some women who had been cured of evil spirits and infirmities. Mary, called Magdalene, from whom 7 demons had gone out, and Joanna, the wife of Herod's steward Chusa, and Susanna, and many others who provided for them out of their resources. So clearly Jesus had some financial support. I probably didn't need a lot of financial support if you're just wandering around, in your sandals and you have one change of clothing that you're wearing.
But still, you need, I've always, even as a kid, I thought, okay, there had to be more than just these 12. Who was cooking their meals and washing their socks? I mean, there's just well, but just day-to-day living.
Yeah.
Someone had to take care of that, even though their needs and demands were small. They didn't have a big house to take care of or something like that. There's still things that need to be done for people to survive.
Well, and you have stories about 5,000 people and loaves and fishes,
Yeah.
Enough to feed a boy. And yet somehow it fed the 5,000. And I know some people felt that was a miraculous event, and some people felt that the miracle was that it caused other people to share, what they brought for their lunch with everybody else. And so in the end, everybody had enough, and there was leftovers. So
First potluck.
I'm sure that was fairly common.
First potluck.
Paul, I
But they
spent a
had
little
hamburgers.
time in India, and in the Hindu faith, there's sadhus, which are holy people that wander India, giving blessings and teaching and disciples of Hinduism, and they walk in sandals. And I did have this interesting little comparison or epiphany. I was like, oh, this is kind of maybe culturally similar of what the apostles and Jesus and John the Baptist were doing in their time. And it's something contemporary. We have contemporary examples of holy men wandering, and it's this communal, it's reciprocal with the citizens of India and the parishioners. I mean, they have rules. They can't go back to the same school or family asking for food or to bathe. They can't overstay.
Yeah.
But they're in return, they do give their blessing and their teaching, and then they will move on.
It's the same in Buddhism. The monks can have a bowl. Maybe you've heard of a Buddha bowl. It's rice with vegetables and things on it. But they, whatever that will fit in that bowl, they can expect to receive from the community. And they carry their bowl with them, but they have a higher purpose. Being a monk, there's a monastic purpose to that. To take care, help other people, but then when it comes down to being fed, they can expect to be fed.
Well, I know when we went to Thailand, on the airplane before we landed, they had apples. There was a nice, pretty red apple. And my sister's maid wanted to know if she could have that apple. Sure, and she wanted it so she could give it to the Buddhist monks because their apples over there aren't nice and pretty red, they're more green and not real pretty. And that would give her an extra blessing that she was able to provide something special to the Buddhist monk.
Here's another scripture from Luke. Jesus called the 12 together and gave them power and authority over all demons and to cure diseases, and he sent them out to proclaim the kingdom of God and to heal. And he said to them, take nothing for your journey, no staff, no bag, nor bread, nor money, not even an extra tunic. Whatever house you enter, stay there and leave from there. So, presumably if they were staying with somebody as a guest, of course, there's probably more hospitality rules in the Middle East than we sometimes have in this country. But I think they could expect to be cared for a short period of time, and maybe not to overstay their welcome.
Yeah.
And then in John it talks about Judas being the keeper of the purse for the disciples, and so that suggests that if Judas was the treasurer and carried the checkbook around for the rest of them, then probably they were doing this all things common approach to life.
Yeah, because wasn't it Judas who got mad at Mary Magdalene for buying
Yeah, for
perfume and
spending a day's
not
worth of
using
wages
it
or something.
for taking
a
care of
year's worth
poor?
wages, yeah. So, and then, the accusation that John made about Judas was that he had been stealing from the purse. But I've also heard a little different interpretation that the reason he sold Jesus into being arrested was because he thought Jesus was going to be able to get out of it using his power. And with the 30 pieces of silver, they could use that to feed the poor or take care of the group or whatever. I don't know if there's merit to that interpretation, but I have heard it that way. All right, there ain't no free lunch. I think that kind of describes maybe a little bit more about the American economic system. That was first coined by a journalist, Walter Morrow, in 1938. Does anybody know where that statement came from? There ain't no free lunch. Have you heard of that before? Milton Friedman, who was an economist, was famous for saying that, but he came 30 or 40 years later, so it wasn't originally him. In those days, I think probably as part of the Depression, there were bars who, for the price of the alcohol that people would come in and buy a beer or whatever, would offer a free lunch. And Morrow was saying, you're paying extra for the beer. There ain't no free lunch. So you're ultimately paying no matter what you think you're doing. Goulder, our author, suggests that by 48 CE, the Jerusalem church was challenged to provide support for the number of poor converts who had joined. As Dennis said earlier, they encouraged Paul to take up a collection from the wealthy Gentiles. And then he talks a little bit about this group called the Ebionim, the poor Christians who were scattered from Jerusalem. They were still poor in 70 AD when Jerusalem was sacked by the Romans, and they became known as the Ebionim or the Ebionites. And they actually, there's records of them through the early part of history down to about the 5th or the 7th century, and then they kind of disappeared. So whoever these poor were that were relationship with the early Christians, they did persist and continued to be identified that way for several hundred years. So that was interesting. All right, let's talk about the followers of Peter. So we have to look at the Sermon on the Mount. Wasn't somebody help me with my memory here? Was Matthew a tax collector? Wasn't he a tax collector?
Yes.
Oh, thank you. And I thought that was kind of interesting that here's Matthew recording the Sermon on the Mount with that type of a background as a civil servant, basically a government worker collecting taxes for the Romans. And he has Jesus saying, "Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and rust consume and where thieves break in and steal, but store up for yourselves treasures in heaven. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. No one can serve two masters, or a slave will either hate the one and love the other, or be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and wealth. And he goes on, Jesus goes on to say in the Sermon on the Mount, therefore I tell you, do not worry about your life, what you will eat, what you will drink, or about your body, what you will wear. Look at the birds of the air. They neither sow nor reap nor gather into barns, and yet your heavenly Father feeds them. What do you think what do these passages say to you about early Christian views on money? And is there a way that we can incorporate this into our lives, these teachings?
I think it was a good thing they lived in a warm climate. I mean, we just have needs that have to be filled. And it's hard to relate what they lived in and what we live, how we live.
I also think some of this is related to the expectation that the second coming was very soon, it was imminent. And that laying up great wealth was pointless because Jesus was to return soon.
I mean, I agree with you 100%. I think that's a powerful motivator if you think that the return of Jesus is right around the corner and there may not be time for all of this. And we have the advantage of looking back after 2,000 years and seeing that has not occurred. And so our, changes our perspective a little. I agree with that.
Well, I think it also relates back to the time of Moses, when God provided for him in the desert the food and manna from heaven, and reminding them that, you don't have to spend every minute of your time worrying about how you're going to do that. God will provide things when it's needed.
I think, it's calling us to take care of other people and not worrying about ourselves. And I think I can kind of remember this being kind of a foundational concept in my family's growing up, especially with my father. He always was taking care of other people as an appointee, as a ministry, he was always out. And he failed to take care of himself to some degree. And he was never there for family. So, he took him, I think he lived that, kind of life. And I think you got to find a balance. We lost him at 49 because he was constantly, giving so much that he didn't take care of himself to the extent he probably could have. So, balance. Got to be a middle ground there. So,
I think another thing the New Testament teaches do for us, though, is something I think we still need to hear today, that the poor have worth. So often they're dismissed because they're painted with a broad stroke that they're unambitious or lazy or they just don't get it or something. And that's an unfair depiction of why people are poor. There are many, many reasons. Some we can help change. And we need to be part of lifting them up as much as possible.
Some of that is left over from Victorian times, I think. We've been watching some old documentaries called The American Experience. Mm-hmm. And the one we were looking at last night was about New York in the late 1800s. And the attitude back then was that if you were poor, you did something, there was something wrong with you. I mean, you did something bad. Mm-hmm. And so people just, they starved.
By the way, Karen, who's online, indicated it's hard to hear the folks in the back row, so please be sure you speak up so that people on Zoom can hear also.
My relationship with hospital in Kumasi, Ghana has been really enlightening in some ways with respect to that. They have many bright people there, physicians, nurses, technicians. What they lack is resources. And if you look at the history of that country, and this permeates the African continent, through the period that Europe colonized Africa, in the case of Ghana, the British hauled off all the gold. They took everything and slaves. They literally raped the country and left almost nothing. So you look at that and you say, well, how can the Ghanaian people be responsible for that? I mean, they're doing pretty well considering where they started from in the 1960s. They've made a lot of advances, but they still have an awful lot of needs there. So there's a lot of human unkindness that has taken place in the world that have put at least some people in bad positions. So
There's a phrase that has always resonated with me of do your best and leave the rest to God. That you don't just lay back and do nothing and expect God to take care of you. We have a responsibility to do our best.
all right, so that was the kind of the practice of the Jerusalem church. Now let's look at some of the things that Paul wrote and see how he might have differed from them. I think that's the whole point of this chapter, is to show that there were differences. And he says, now concerning love of the brothers and sisters, you do not need to have anyone write to you, for you yourselves have been taught by God to love one another. And indeed, you do love all the brothers and sisters throughout Macedonia. So Paul acknowledges that Christians should love one another, and we do. But we urge you, beloved, to do more and more, to aspire to live quietly, to mind your own affairs, and to work with your hands as we directed you, so that no one may behave properly toward outsiders and be dependent on no one. That's from 1 Thessalonians. And then from 2 Thessalonians, now we commanded you, beloved, in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, to keep away from believers who are living in idleness. Who's he talking about here? Goulder would say he's talking about the Jerusalem church, that they don't want to work. At least that's Paul's interpretation of what's going on. And not according to the tradition that you received from us. For you yourselves know how you ought to imitate us. We were idle when we were with you. We did not eat anyone's bread without paying for it. But with toil and labor, we worked night and day so that we might not burden any of you. And this was not because we do not have that right, but in order to give you an example to imitate. What did Paul do for a living? You remember what his secular job was? Tent maker. Yeah. And I think there are places in the New Testament where it talks about him working as a tent maker while he was giving ministry to these churches.
Was that after his conversion? Or,
Yeah.
So before he was a Pharisee.
Well, he was so Pharisee is kind of like we do in this church.
Okay.
We have
That
ministers.
wasn't a job. That
Yeah.
wasn't like appointees.
I don't know. Maybe he received some care for that, but I know he said he was a tent maker. So
Okay.
Did he work with Priscilla and her husband?
Yeah.
he was a weaver of fine cloth or something.
Well, isn't Paul, I read this, and I think Goulder is trying to tell us that Paul was once again, just like in the sex chapter, well, here's what I'm doing, and I'm a little bit more perfect. You can try to imitate me, but you're not going to be very good at it. Is that good?
Yeah, so we're coming up to that.
Okay, thank you.
So,
Sorry, that irritates me a little
A
bit.
quick question
Paul
here.
irritates you a little bit.
He always irritates me.
Was the Jerusalem church or the Petrine radical Christianity a noble aspiration, or was it an excuse for selfish idleness? Who do you agree with?
Well, one thing I think Goulder points out is when we talk about idleness, though, he says they were busybodies. They were busy doing church work, visiting and praying for people and administering to people and doing all these things. They weren't earning money, but he called them busybodies. So I don't know if you would call them idle or not. I was going to mention here in section 42, they have the same issue. It comes up. What I say?
Well, tell me.
Section 42, where it says, "Thou shalt not be idle, for he that is idle shall not eat the bread nor wear the garment of the laborer." That brought up a problem because later they say, "Thou shalt not take thy brother's garment." So there's this sharing in common had practical problems. Evidently, they're borrowing each other's clothes without permission or anything.
There you go, that's how you do it.
What's the year of that revelation?
1831.
31? Yeah. Okay, so it's
Yeah,
pre
31.
Nabu.
Yeah, that was in Kirtland.
Early, okay.
It seemed like a short-term venture to me. I know Andrew Bolton is a real big proponent of all things in common. That is the ideal, it seems like in his mind, when I hear him. He goes to acts but the practicalities seem like, we see what we talked about Paul, seems like it was a short-term aspiration, noble, but
So that's a great segue to this next question, Dennis. Is there a conflict between sharing what we have with others and everyone working to help sustain themselves? Or in other words, in an ideal world, is it possible to have both? Is there such thing as an ideal world where we share things equally? Is this a vision of the early Christian church that never somehow materialized because human behavior gets in the way, or do you think it was just a ill-conceived idea?
isn't that what we call Zion?
Is that what we call Zion? Good question.
But I do think there are some communities, I'm trying to think of the name of them, that kind of practice this a lot more closely. Maybe not perfectly, but more closely.
Well, the Shakers, it seemed to me, were a little more successful. Little I know about the Shakers, and I've read a little bit. Everyone was assigned a job. No one was sitting around waiting to have someone serve them. Some people had trades of carpentry or weaving cloth or whatever. And others maybe were less skilled, but they still had a job, whether they swept out the meeting house. I mean, so that everyone was expected to contribute somehow to the sustaining of the group. And I think they were successful for quite a while, but that has faded
Well,
away.
weren't they the ones who didn't believe in marriage or
Oh,
anything,
They were celibate.
having children? Yeah,
Right.
so, it's gonna run out of,
Right, unless more
People
people
soon.
keep coming
They didn't read
in.
chapter
Yeah.
9, apparently.
The group I was thinking was called the Bruderhof. They're still in existence.
Did everybody on Zoom hear? Could you hear what Sharon was talking about, the Shakers? Anybody? Anybody repeated? So she was basically saying that everybody in the Shaker community had a job and it contributed to the well-being of the community. Everybody was relied upon for something that they did.
kibbutz in Israel were like that, but I think they also probably have their own money at times, but they did share the work. And
When I was at Graceland in the early 80s, a friend of mine was a part of a group in Blue Springs, Missouri, which I do not remember the name of that group, but they all had homes kind of real close to each other.
Oh, what was that called?
And they were practicing
I'm trying to remember
that.
too.
Harvest Hills, isn't it?
Harvest
Might have
Hills,
been,
yeah.
might have
Yeah.
been, yeah. So he always was telling me these kinds of stories where they would be sharing everything, and I'm just like 20 going, wow, that's weird.
Yeah, I've heard of communities where rather than everybody owning a lawnmower, they have one lawnmower and everybody
Yeah.
uses it. And when they need a new lawnmower, they all chip in.
And
that
everybody
kind
had
of
a
stuff.
job,
Yeah.
in the community. I kind of
Well,
like it.
let's go
Yeah, if
through
you
one
do
more
anything.
story that's kind of hard to understand. And this is, I think, the one that Jane was talking about initially, the eye of the needle.
Can I butt in for one
Sure.
second?
Tracy, that's how
Go
it
back
works.
one slide.
Mhm.
On your question regarding in an ideal world, can there be both? Isn't that what we basically practice? Aren't we Christian capitalists? I mean, we hopefully individually through the church and in other ways, we contribute to the poor and to the needy and the people who need that. But we are certainly capitalists. We certainly believe in a free enterprise kind of system and making money and preparing for the future. And we're certainly Christian. So isn't the answer to your question, yes, they can coexist, but realizing that we also have a very capitalistic bias to it.
Well, and I think we're not at the ideal yet. The ideal would be that there are no more poor. If
No,
that
I
system is going to work, at what point can we declare that poverty has been abolished in the world?
Yeah.
We're a long way from that, but yes, I see your point.
The percentages are a little different than 50.
What's that?
The percentages are a little different than 50.
Yeah, yeah.
But didn't Jesus tell us there would always be poor among us?
Well, I don't know if that was being prophetic or just his observation that we can't fix it.
Either way, he was telling us a big.
Yeah.
I think Jesus was saying, actually, there's always poor. Why is that? Why is there a systemic problem here that there's always poor? I think he's challenging the situation, actually.
Well, and if in his day, if truly 80% of all people were in that category, it probably seemed very overwhelming that was ever going to change. I mean, that just was life the way it was then. All right, well, let's talk about the story of the rich man. Jesus encounters a rich man who wants to know what he needs to do to get into the kingdom. And Jesus said, sell all that you have and give to the poor. First question, how does this story strike you? Has it ever made you feel guilty about having possessions, of having a decent life, I guess?
When does it not make us feel guilty?
Well, it certainly has been used that way, right?
Well, I always thought it was a story to kind of take you back, that makes you think, okay, what are my priorities? What is my focus in life? Is it for me? Or is it so I can be good? So I can sustain my family, my church?
This is very different in my mind from God saying 10% of what you have. I want everything. I want it all.
Well, I mean, I'm assuming this was a rich person who had inherited his money. He hadn't earned it, and maybe an idle rich, and they're just playing around, not doing anything.
Well, in one of them, he was a lawyer. Lawyers work.
Well, that's what I was saying. I'm not talking about that one.
Or a businessman. I mean, I think he was talking to all the rich.
Yeah,
not
maybe.
just
Well,
the
I'm
idle.
sure, but I mean, in this case, it could have been, somebody who's just idle, like what
Yeah,
idle rich playing around with money.
Well, we
Never had
don't
work.
know. We don't know
We
if
don't
he was
really
idle
know.
rich. We don't know if he was a lawyer who was charging too much.
I deserve
I
that.
mean, maybe this is Edelman. I don't know.
Oh.
We don't know any of those. We're left to interpret it in light, each of us in light of our own situation and existence. The author says it was surprising to him that this story is from Mark's gospel. Why did he say that?
Because Mark was a Pauline.
Mhm.
Yeah.
But he knew that the story was prevalent. So it's kind of like, you can't quite sweep it under the rug.
Yeah.
Goulder gave Mark an excuse.
Yeah. Didn't Levine say basically Jesus was using hyperbole on that? We've heard explanations before. There was a gate that I've read that she said that didn't exist in Jerusalem. And in her book, then she said that was real. Jesus liked to use hyperbole to make a point.
Yeah, so the idea was there was a gate that was too small for a camel to pass through, and so they called it the eye of the needle. That was kind of the story I'd always heard.
But she said that wasn't true.
And I think, there was a small gate getting into Jerusalem,
Yeah.
that you can get through.
Well, this is the difference between the two accounts. So we have Mark saying, the really hard lesson: you lack one thing, go sell what you own, give the money to the poor, and then you'll have treasure in heaven. Matthew edits it a little bit, and this is interesting because Matthew is supposedly from the Peter's group, and he says, if you would be perfect, go and sell what you possess and give to the poor. And so what Goulder says is maybe there's different levels of being Christian. Maybe there's, the highest level, which is the people who would sell everything that they have. I remember a story some years ago in the Kansas City Star, many years ago. There was a guy who worked at one of the hospitals up on Hospital Hill. I think it was the old Trinity Lutheran Hospital that was up there. And he worked he kind of did odd jobs. I think he worked in the cafeteria. And they interviewed him for the story. I think every 5 years or something like that, everything that he had accumulated in that time, he gave away and he started over. And he gave it to people who needed it more than he did. And that was just his life's practice. That was the way he wanted to. And I don't know that he was a particularly religious person. I don't remember people talking about that. I just remember that he had this practice that every 5 years he wiped the slate clean, maybe it was 7 years, and started all over. But I thought, that's kind of interesting. That's the only example that I personally had ever heard of somebody who maybe embraced this. But then Goulder says maybe there's others that have to be content to be second-class Christians who can also be saved too. And he said this is the road down the Catholic mainstream. I think it's the road down Christian mainstream. I wouldn't limit that maybe to just the Catholics.
Well, there's kind of a TV program similar to that, where the guy goes in and he gets people together and starts a billionaire company, out from grassroots things.
Are you talking about Shark Tank?
No, this was on, I didn't watch it, but the guy would go into an area and he was a rich guy and all, but he would go in and he'd, show people, that working together here with this idea, we can turn it into $1 billion company with, very little stuff. And, maybe the rich guy has the talents that, if he sells all that he's got, that he's not going to end up being one of the poor guys that's going to be dependent on maybe he's got the talents to sell all of his stuff and, start over again where he doesn't become a burden on somebody else. So maybe God's just telling him to, hey, use what you got.
All right, just a couple more things and we're almost out of time here. Yes, Jerry.
Paul, it's been a long time since I've thought about what our church has done or been, but our discussion this morning really makes me remember my own experience as a kid at the Grandview, Kansas congregation, which was back in the 1930s. And I remember everything we're talking about in the way of scripture was scripture we learned back then. And the possibility of selling what you have and forming a community, that was preached as a possible ideal, but hardly ever carried out. But in the Grandview congregation, where I was just a kid and attending, that was in the 1930s, we had the kind of differing people like we're talking about this morning. Very few, one or two families maybe really had what we call enough to say, well, we're wealthy, and the rest of the congregation, not at all. Many out of work, including my father. That congregation would put together whatever was needed to help somebody in need. And that continued throughout that entire, I never thought about it. It's sessions like this morning that made that come back into my mind and remembering what happened at a congregation where the people were not so much worried about are we doing the right thing that's going to get me up to the 7th floor, tomorrow or whenever I die. But people were carrying out a function of caring for other people. And that continued throughout my entire childhood to the best of my memory here back in the 1930s. And as I thought about what we're talking here this morning, we read the scriptures and we look about that and say that was an ideal. But ideals are recreated day after day after day by what we do. And I'm just grateful for that kind of testimony that came out of a congregation, out of the people that nurtured me through my
I think that's been mostly my experience too. My mom was a great role model for us kids, and I can remember when a member of the congregation lost his job and they were struggling to make ends meet. She went out to the commissary, the food store at Fort Leavenworth, and filled up her trunk full of groceries and dropped it off at their house. I mean, people just did things for others when they were aware that there was a need, and that seems to be a kind of a moderated response. It's not the same as selling everything that you have, but it was the necessary response to meet the needs of the moment.
Kind of like food pantries nowadays. So.
Yeah.
I think they've had studies that show on a percentage basis that the poor are more generous than the rich, actually.
I've got a couple of more slides we're not going to get through, so I'm just going to let you look these scriptures up on your own. Look, maybe compare Sermon on the Mount with the Sermon on the Plain, so Matthew with Luke, and see what the Beatitudes say when it talks about blessed are the poor. That would be one assignment for next week. Then look up the story of Zacchaeus, the tax collector, who paid back 4 times everything that he had taken and what Jesus said to him. And I think we'll call it good for this week. Next week, chapter 11, the ministry and the church.
Thank you, Paul.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, I'm not sure my interpretations are all the right ones, but there certainly are a lot of questions about this that I have lived with in my life.
Well, you know, a little thing, another thing that we learned from our trip to Thailand was that, you know, he tells them don't even take an extra tunic and stuff. Well, over there, you could go to the beach or to the little community where you were living, and they would have kind of a communal water source out in the middle of kind of like a big cattle trough type area. And they could go in there and actually bathe out in the middle of the day, and nobody would know what they were, you know, that was what they were doing because of the way they do it. And they could wash their clothes. They would go in the Klong, which was the river, even though it was really nasty, dirty, but that's how they bathed. And they would just wear their clothes in there and bathe and you know, go on. And, you know, we always see the pictures of Jesus in a beautiful white cloak, but, you know, I'm sure that most of them didn't smell the greatest and they didn't look all sparkly white all the time either. We just have a different conception in America than what a lot of the third world and other countries do on the level that Jesus was traveling.
All right. The end.
Thank you, Paul.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you.